In a world already tense with conflict and shifting alliances, the recent summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Alaska was billed as a turning point. For some, it was the long awaited chance for diplomacy to break through. For others, it was nothing more than political theater. And as the world soon learned, this summit delivered more disappointment than progress. Alaska, the symbolic meeting ground between East and West, hosted the first U.S. Russia summit on American soil since 2007. Expectations were high, at least in the media, but those who followed the preparations closely predicted something very different: a deadlock. And that is exactly what happened. The summit ended without an agreement, without a ceasefire, and without even the faintest hint of common ground. Instead, what the world saw was a hardening of positions, especially from Moscow. Vladimir Putin came to Alaska with a clear message: Russia has the upper hand in Ukraine. Reports confirm he laid down an uncompromising offer. Either the West accepts a deal where Russia keeps half of Ukraine, or there will be no deal at all. This was not the language of negotiation. This was the language of power. By putting such stark terms on the table, Putin essentially told Trump, Russia is advancing, and we are not backing down. Trump, for all his bravado, refused to accept those conditions. And so, as expected, the talks collapsed. The failure of this summit illustrates just how intractable the Ukraine conflict has become. Putin's demand for territorial concessions reflects his growing confidence born out of battlefield realities. For the U.S., and for Trump specifically, this was a reminder of the limits of diplomacy when the balance of power is so uneven. Without significant leverage, summits like these are destined to fail. And in this case, failure may mean a prolonged and bloody conflict with no end in sight. But the summit wasn't only about Ukraine. One of the most fascinating threads was how India factored into discussions, specifically India's growing imports of Russian oil. Despite American tariffs and diplomatic pressure, India has continued and even increased its purchases of Russian crude. In fact, in August, India cut back on imports from Iraq while boosting its reliance on cheaper Russian supplies. This is a striking example of India's strategic autonomy. For New Delhi, the calculation is simple. Affordable energy comes first, and no amount of U.S. pressure has been able to change that. Trump had earlier claimed that his tariff strategy would force India to rethink its ties with Russia. But reality told a very different story. Instead of compliance, India doubled down on its independence. The result? 25 years of careful U.S.-India diplomatic progress took a hit. Trump's unilateral tariff policy backfired, damaging relations rather than strengthening them. It was a lesson in how blunt economic coercion often fails in today's multipolar world. India's stance shows that large emerging economies are less willing than ever to bow to external pressure, even when it comes from Washington. Beyond policy, the summit also raised uncomfortable questions about Trump himself. His statements before and after the meeting were contradictory, sometimes misleading, and often outright false. For example, Trump publicly claimed that India had reduced its Russian oil imports under his watch. Yet the data shows the exact opposite. He boasted that he alone has prevented wars, while conflicts from Ukraine to Taiwan remain volatile. This pattern of exaggeration and misinformation doesn't just hurt Trump's image. It undermines the credibility of U.S. foreign policy as a whole. When leaders make claims that are easily disproven, allies grow skeptical, and adversaries grow emboldened. And sometimes the most revealing messages in diplomacy are not spoken at all. At this summit, Russia's foreign minister appeared wearing a t-shirt with the bold letters USSR printed across the front. At first glance, it might have seemed like a casual fashion choice. But in reality, it was a symbol. A reminder that Russia's leadership still views itself through the lens of Soviet-era expansionism. This nonverbal statement told the world that Russia was here not to compromise, but to project strength. In international relations, symbolism matters. And in this case, the symbolism was unmistakable. And then there was the viral video that added yet another layer of meaning. In it, Putin casually tells a young student that Russia's borders never end. On the surface, it may sound like a joke, but placed against the backdrop of war in Ukraine, it reveals something much deeper, a mindset rooted in expansion. To Putin and his circle, Russia is not constrained by geography. Its sphere of influence is cultural, historical, and potentially limitless. This ideological foundation explains much of Russia's recent behavior. It's not simply about Ukraine. It's about reshaping borders and rewriting the rules of international order. So, what does all of this mean? The Alaska summit was not just a failure. It was a demonstration of how little progress diplomacy can make when the balance of power is so lopsided. India's oil strategy shows that major emerging economies are willing to chart their own course, even when pressured by superpowers. Trump's missteps and credibility issues remind us that leadership is about more than rhetoric. It is about trust and consistency. And finally, the symbolism of Russia's posture, from Soviet imagery to boundless borders, reveals a nation that still sees itself as a global empire in the making. In the end, this summit was less about agreements and more about messages. Russia's message was clear: we are strong, we are advancing, and we will not compromise. India's message was equally clear: we will not be told where to buy our energy. And Trump's message, though loud, was often inconsistent, leaving America's role in this global drama more uncertain than ever. The Alaska summit may be remembered not for what it achieved, but for what it revealed: the persistence of conflict, the resilience of strategic autonomy, and the power of symbolism in shaping world affairs. As the world watches Ukraine, as India balances its interests, and as America grapples with its credibility, one truth remains: geopolitics is not about quick fixes or bold statements. It is about patience, leverage, and the unyielding pursuit of national interest. And in that regard, this summit was a masterclass in failure.